asked to maybe draw some of the comments together. So I've looked at positives and negatives, like a small SWOT analysis of the presentations this morning. I think for the first time we have a clear, coordinated and I would say an ambitious investment programme coupled with the National Spatial Planning Framework, and it's based on evidence-based policy. Now this is quite a first, and I think it's something which we shouldn't underestimate. We heard several times today that it's going to be delivered using an activist approach, which is also quite important because it's an acknowledgement that that requires leadership. The budget is identified, 116 billion euros. That's the minimum expectation. Private sector will step in and will increase that amount, as indeed will lending, as our economic circumstances improve. There's a climate change dimension to the National Development Plan that very few people mentioned. The National Development Plan and the Strategic Policy Framework are based on the current National Mitigation Plan and the current National Adaptation Plan and indeed the Energy White Paper. So there's quite a strong climate change dimension to what we're trying to do. There are challenges. Robert identified many of them. And I think setting up the Public Sector Training Academy is one of the ways that that has been recognised. There is a delivery board. Every good government programme has a delivery board, but this has been led at Secretary-General level. Curiously, it's not been chaired by the Department of the Taoiseach, it's been chaired by the Department of Expenditure, or Public Expenditure. Now, in other countries where there's major strategic issues, it is the Prime Minister's office takes charge, but in Ireland we're doing it slightly differently. Very importantly, which wasn't mentioned, the construction industry has now been brought in, and construction industry professionals in a construction sector group to work with the Programme Delivery Board. So the key stakeholders have been brought into the process, and that's only very recent. I think that's hugely, hugely important. We have a project office, a DPR project office, small in scale, and it will grow. We have a project tracker. I checked it out yesterday. It is hugely informative. Every single one of the 271 projects and programmes, where they are, what the budgets are, have been identified. So that's very interesting for project promoters. Another positive is that all significant projects have to pass the public spending appraisal code. So unless you get value for money for your project, it can't go into procurement. In fact, this is a key theme that runs through the National Development Plan. If you read the National Development Plan, you see value for money, public sector spending code on nearly every page. Another positive is that there have been 4 competitive funds set up. For example, the Fund on Urban Development will greatly help the reconstruction and redevelopment of the Tivoli port in Cork, which will put probably 4,000 to 5,000 houses, mixed housing, into the city centre of Cork, and that will be done through the call for proposals. That was done by way of competitive tendering as one of the 4 proposals. But it's not all rosy. Everything has its downsides. In listening to the presentations this morning, I said to myself, how many more strategies do we need before decisions are actually taken? We have the MASP, the Metropolitan Areas spatial plans to be produced. Then other plans have to fit into this. So we've actually imposed a layer of delay, perhaps necessary delay in some respects, but some key plans, until they're in place, will result in major transport hubs and other investments not being taken in the short term. They will happen in the medium term. If you read the National Development Plan, and nobody mentioned it this morning, is how are we going to pay for it all? There is a budget. There's no mention of user charges. There's no mention of toll roads. There's no mention of putting a carbon tax on our energy and energy efficiency investments. There's no mention of increasing the residential property tax to pay for local environment and other charges. I think we need to have a debate if we're going to have this level of ambition to say who's going to pay for it all and how is it going to be paid for. It is quite normal you pass on your costs to the consumer. And we have huge levels of ambition, but we'll have to pay for it. You take the carbon tax. The carbon tax was introduced at 20 euros a tonne 6, 7, 8 years ago. It has had no impact whatsoever on people's behaviour into the use of hydrocarbons in fuel. Why? Because it's too low. Unless you put triple, quadruple, increase it by tenfold, the carbon tax will have no impact. As it is at the moment, it's a misnomer. It's just collecting general revenue. But I would argue you should put carbon tax on around €80 a tonne. That will generate €1.5 billion a year. Hypothecate that fund and put it into energy-related and energy efficiency-related investments. And therefore you get a pipeline of work that's paid for by the consumer. But they know when they're being taxed that they're getting in return energy efficiency investments. Another gap in the whole analysis is procurement, tendering. There's not one single mention of procurement in the National Development Plan. Nobody's told if they get a project, how will they secure a developer or a builder or an operator. Nothing is said. It's a big silent. Again, it's like user charges. The construction work management framework, because I've experience in this area, is no longer fit for purpose. It's an utter dog's dinner, excuse the French. If you're trying to get a project through the construction work management framework, it will drive you mad. The documentation is utterly unnecessary in very many respects. It's not compliant with the current procurement directives. It's out of date, and as Robert indicated, it is being reformed, but they will usually tinker with it. It needs a radical overhaul. If you want to get things happening, you make the procurement rules as simple as possible and attract bigger investment for bigger projects, and that is not the current mindset. There are serious capacity issues. If I was Owen Keegan and somebody told me, it is your job, Owen Keegan, to develop 40,000 houses within the canals, and I would be Owen Keegan saying, well, what do I need to do? Well, the delivery board will help you, Owen. Well, I was Owen, I would say, well, I'm going to market now. I'm going to seek a provider, a contractor to build 40,000 houses. I'm going to give that contractor delegated authority to do it. We'll give him the planning supports. He can get the employment wherever he wants to get it. I don't care where it comes from, as long as I get my 40,000 houses. And I need 100 people in my housing office to help that contractor deliver the project. And I want you, government, to recruit those 100 people for me and let it happen. That will not happen, gentlemen and ladies. That's not the way we work. That's not the way we think. Instead of which, there'll be 1,500, 1,700 micro-siloed projects procured over the next 20 years, and we will still have 40,000 houses to build at the end of it. We just need to think differently when we come to procuring projects. We have a very antiquated way and a very unambitious way when it comes to procurement. Well, we have a project tracker. There's not one named individual for any one of the 271 projects that says, I'm in charge. Please phone me if you need any information. There's no point in having a project tracker if the people responsible for that project haven't got their name on the tracker. And hopefully when the next version of it is published, there'll be a tad more transparency. The National Development Plan and the Spatial Framework, to a lesser extent, is not Brexit proofed. We don't know what Brexit is, but an iteration of the plan will need to be Brexit proofed. And it's not border poll proofed either. And we should be thinking, as we will be long term, about integrating the infrastructure on the island of Ireland. There will be common healthcare provision, there will be common transport needs, common rail, north and south, etc. And it will happen at some stage. And I think we should also need to reflect that the National Development Plan falls short in that regard. I'm a great believer in using existing agencies, and for the life of me, I don't see why the Land Development Agency wasn't basically made a subsidiary of NAMA, or had NAMA had its remit. They've got a fantastic board in NAMA. They've really good chairman and a board of directors. You don't need to set up new state agencies. New state agencies require legislation. Legislation results in delays, etc. And you should be using the Housing Agency or NAMA to deliver whatever you want. And setting up new agencies, quite frankly, is a traditional civil service way of postponing things. But I know there's good intent here, but we could have used existing agencies. A small point, but it's important. I was in Brussels last week with a client, and there is a €46 billion grant project programme has been published for transport, public transport, energy and ICT projects. We normally get 1% of EU funds. So we should be in line to get €1.5 billion from this Connecting Europe facility for our roads, railways, ports, etc. Is there a strategy in government to say we're going to target this? No. We have a strategy to track Horizon 2020 projects, that's important, but we've no strategy in place in government to say we're going to put the same level of attention to track and get these EU-funded projects in Brussels, which also will add to the availability of funding. Another small thing is that the delivery board, to my knowledge, hasn't got a risk register in place, which is basic good practice in the commercial world. So if you're running a major programme like this, you should have a risk register. That would identify to the decision makers if things like price inflation are happening, you put in place mitigation measures. If there are project bottlenecks, you identify them and invest in those project bottlenecks. If the planning arrangements aren't working, you adjust and change the planning arrangements. So the delivery board should be looking at the risk register that's associated with the delivery of these two major projects. And the final comment I'll make is, before I put 3 or 4 questions, from what I'm hearing, the demographic forecasts suggest that the scale of ambition that we have is already seriously off target, and we haven't even got to first base. So there's going to have to be a recalibration of the National Development Plan, and also, as a consequence, the budgets that are supporting it. And we can't be doing that 4 to 5 years from now. That should be done during the course of this year. I have a few questions. There are current and well-acknowledged disconnects between the level of ambition and the capacity to deliver. There are bottlenecks, but these should be identified, put into the open to say, we have the following 4 problems. We can't deliver because of X, Y, and Z. And then see what we collectively can do to remediate or mitigate these bottlenecks. I also get a sense, and perhaps I'm unique in the room, I don't get any sense of urgency. We've got a great strategy. We know exactly what we want. We've identified the projects. But of all the projects that are listed, a fraction of the 271 projects, I think 6 are actually in procurement at the moment. That tells me there's a big pipeline to come. And where and how is all this going to be accelerated? So I think we need to see a sense of urgency. And linked to that will be a better communications plan by government to say to everyone in the room and everyone widely in the population, this National Development Plan, the National Spatial Framework are hugely important, and this is what we're doing about it. I also will put the question that how, within 30 years, how can the island of Ireland sustain affordable public services for a population probably in the ballpark of 9-10 million? We have to look to the island of Ireland infrastructure requirements, and we cannot have a national spatial strategy that stops at the border. That's ridiculous, because the island has so much in common in terms of infrastructure. And that's a gap, something we need to address in the foreseeable future. If you want to get anything done in government, you have a minister at the cabinet table who has a unique brief. So should there be a minister and a department for national investment and sustainable regional development? Probably at this stage. If I had 116 billion euros to spend over the next 10 to 15 years, which it triples is quite a huge amount of money, I would like to have somebody in charge. And you could ask yourself, should the resources within the public sector be redeployed into that department? There are 340,000 public servants in the state, or soon will be. How many of them are actually working on infrastructure projects, procurement, implementation and contract management? 4,000, 5,000? So 2 to 3% perhaps of the entire public sector is actually responsible for what we're talking about today. And it accounts for 20% of the current budget every year. So we're spending probably far too much of our public sector effort into services and not spending enough of it into capital delivery, works, procurement, etc. So that's a question I have in my head which I haven't been able to answer, and I don't think today is the place to answer it, but it is a question I think we do need to ask. Do we have the right people sitting at the right desks doing the right job? Thank you.